What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today we are traveling to Cancun, the brand new location added to Marvel Snap, and a totally unique one. Power here doesn't count towards winning the game. What exactly does that mean, and what are the best cards to play? Let's dive in. So first, what does a typical Cancun game look like even? Well, I think it's helpful to start off by thinking about this location as sort of a sanctum sanctorum where players can't play cards. Obviously, it's a little bit different than that, but the main thing that I want to drive home here is that when you can only play to two locations, if your opponent wins one and you win one, you're going to tie in Cancun. So the game largely just comes down to differential between those other two locations. So my first recommendation is Iron Man, and not just Iron Man, Onslaught Iron Man and Mystique Iron Man, really trying to go over the top. Super Scroll Onslaught Iron Man. Just throw all of those into one location. The second location, don't even worry about. And then the third location is Cancun, where nobody's scoring any power. And as long as you have more power in the location that you win than your opponent has in the location that you lose, then it doesn't really matter, because the game is just going to come down to who has more total power. So that's the best way, I think, to start off thinking about this location, is how do I make the most power possible in one location? Don't worry about playing Marvel Snap, trying to win in two specific locations. Just pick one location and go as crazy as you can, pedal to the metal, whether that's Iron Man or that's some type of like Wong, Black Panther, Odin combo. You still can do Arnim Zola things, it's still possible, but you don't really need to use Arnim Zola. You just have to get as big of a Black Panther as you possibly can in one of those two locations. There are a few other weird concepts that I want to talk about though, and there's basically like 10 cards that I have highlighted here. The first, probably the most basic concept, is going to be with the Hood, which you don't have the drawback of. You can play the Hood specifically in Cancun and then throw the Demon in one of those two real locations, which makes the Hood a reasonable card. I want to give sort of a shout out here to Sentry, which works really well if Cancun is the third location, and also a little bit to Claw. You can play Claw in Cancun as long as Cancun isn't the third location, and then Claw will add 8 power to the location next to it. So those are both also ways that you can kind of like take playing a bad card in one location to then, and not even bad necessarily. I think that in the case of Claw, if you're just playing it as a 5/8, there's probably better things that you can do. But Sentry, if the Void lands in Cancun, that is kind of cool. You just played a 4/8 with absolutely no drawback, no upside either. You can't really Annihilus the Sentry over and expect that to be relevant, but still an interesting way to take advantage. And another way to take advantage, I'm highlighting Quake here, because Quake is by far the coolest way to take advantage of Cancun. This could technically be any location change effect though, and you're getting similar value out of it. But Quake is really, really powerful because basically if your opponent is setting up big with Iron Man and Onslaught in one location, you make that location Cancun, and then you just like get a free win. So I think that Quake has the most upside while also playing into the theme. I think that if you Reality Stone or Scarlet Witch or Rhino or Storm the featured location, boo, boring. It's just, you can do that to any featured location, so it doesn't necessarily make it exciting for Cancun, but I think that Quake provides some really interesting opportunity here. So I did want to highlight that one specifically. And I also talked about some like kind of dead cards that you can put in Cancun and get a bunch of power elsewhere. I think the best options among those are going to be Cerebro / and Mystique, potentially sometimes with Patriot, though I don't really think you want to push it with Patriot, mainly because Patriot plays to all 3 locations generally, but you could wind up playing like a slightly bigger Cerebro list, like Cerebro, 3 or Cerebro 5 that don't flood the board as much as maybe a Cerebro 2 does with like Brood running out of space. Cerebro 2 does have access to Storm, and Cerebro 3 has access to like Scarlet Witch and Rhino potentially, and they both have access to magic sometimes. I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting Quake in Cerebro 3 maybe, that could be cool. But I think that just in general, Cerebro's a great way to get power to the other 2 locations, and also Silver Surfer. Silver Surfer, I think, is a really good way. You just like use Cancun as a setup location, which is what makes it so much different than Sanctum Sanctorum. Sanctum Sanctorum, you are really limited on space. Cancun, you got plenty of room to just chill and enjoy. And then you set up, Silver, you gotta go surfing in Cancun, right? So set up your Wong, do your Silver Surfer, and then add a bunch of power to those other locations. If you wanna look at things the opposite way though, there are a few ways to force your opponent into Cancun. First of which is going to be Jean Grey, which is a little bit spicier, but throw this down into Cancun, assuming that you have a deck that can take advantage of Jean Grey's symmetrical ability, either with cheaper cards or with Jeff, typically cheaper cards with Jeff, or maybe like filling up the location with Jean Grey so you can play elsewhere. Jean Grey on Cancun might just be GG against some decks. There might be players that are then just forced, especially if they've been avoiding Cancun, like it's Sanctum Sanctorum. Otherwise, you play Jean Grey, and then turn 4, 5, and 6, they are basically just committed to that vacation, and they've got to hang out with Jean Grey for a little bit. So Jean Grey definitely seems like a fun pick, and another one that kind of combines a few things we've already talked about, but I wanted to highlight specifically is Mr. Negative, which is kind of the same thing as the Hood. You don't get the -1 power out of Mr. Negative. But then you also get to just have a bigger Iron Man, and Mr. Negative decks can typically really, really go over the top. So I think that it is worth bringing this deck up specifically because you can play this and just have it be a good deck regardless of if Cancun shows up in your games or not, but can definitely go over the top in those games where Cancun is in them. One card that might not see play without Cancun, and this is again kind of like a category of cards. I'm kind of stretching some of these definitions here, but Stegron and I would say Cannonball is the big one right now, right? And then also Juggernaut. And you know what? Potentially Polaris or Spider-Man, though Polaris is actually the least random of all of these. Oh, and Magneto too. Magneto could be very, very neato. Anyway, to get your opponent's cards into Cancun, typically Stegron is like not that great because you're just moving the card elsewhere. Cannonball sees a little bit more play because you get to turn the card into a rock when you've filled up the other locations for your opponent. But for Cancun specifically, you're not looking to make your opponent fill it up. You're actually just forcing your opponent into a vacation, and then that card is going to take the time off and actually just exit out the rest of the game. So if you can knock a key card into Cancun, seems like Stegron could be a game winner. So seems pretty sweet to me. Next up we have the Iron Man, and then Professor X. This one is pretty straightforward, but I think that there are players that might not realize initially how good this card's going to be. Basically, you are trying to Professor X one of the non-Cancun locations and just give your opponent less real estate to work with. You block out 4 spots with Professor X, you block out 4 spots with Cancun. Your opponent only gets to play 4 different spots for the rest of the game, and they might have other ways to manipulate with the cards that they play, manipulate the locations or things like that. But I think that Professor X is potentially getting stronger with this featured location. Another card kind of like Professor X, but also kind of like Jean Grey at the same time. You get the best of both worlds with Dr. Octopus. Either you Doc Ock a non-Cancun location so that your opponent has less real estate, or you Doc Ock and pull 4 of your opponent's cards into Cancun, and now those cards are useless. So I think that Doc Ock definitely has some great stock, and Doc Ock kind of already sees play in those Cannonball Steg decks anyways, so I think that there is a lot to be said for Dr. Octopus today. There's 2 other things I wanted to talk about, the first of which is Galactus, and unfortunately, because Galactus specifies winning at a location, you won't be able to activate it at Cancun. Cancun says nobody is winning here, so Galactus won't work. He's on vacation, and unfortunately, so is Adam Warlock, Crossbones, and Omega Red. None of these cards will be able to satisfy the condition of winning at Cancun. However, Captain Marvel should still work as written. If it's in Cancun, should be able to move out just fine. And on the other side of that spectrum, Martyr will most likely wind up moving into Cancun, assuming that's enough to lose you the game. So those are some extra things to watch out for. Okay, wait, I just thought of something really wacky. If you use Snowguard Hawk, you can disable all locations just long enough to activate Galactus, and then at the end of the game, Cancun will turn back on again, and the game will be a tie with only 1 location with Galactus. And the last thing I want to talk about in this video is Legion, which is a little bit silly. However, there's some interesting things to talk about here with Legion and with other transform, replace location effects, just as a whole. Those effects are going to be pretty strong today, and part of the strength of those cards is in the flexibility, because your opponent doesn't necessarily know if you're just going to be able to transform Cancun on the final turn and win it for yourself. So there's going to be a lot of surprise victories today, and there might also be some surprise ties. One of the reasons that I think Legion is actually worth considering, one, I like when you use Legion to transform all of the locations into the featured location, because when you just storm the featured location, I don't know, something about that just doesn't sit right with me. I think you got to interact with the featured location at least somewhat, and Legion has some really interesting opportunity, because if you are really far behind, you can turn all 3 locations into Cancun and just say no cubes this game. This game's just a tie. However, if the game's looking good for you, then you throw Legion on another location and you grab a surprise win in what was previously Cancun, in the same way that you could with like a Storm or a Rhino or a Scarlet Witch. But I think that Legion is kind of cool in this space because it has some nice flexibility. However, you're probably not beating the flexibility of just being a cheaper card, being a Scarlet Witch that you can play for just 2 energy while also committing energy to another location. If you're using Legion on the final turn, you've got to spend 5 energy in not Cancun and then spend 1 energy in Cancun with like the hood from, or the demon from the hood rather, and try to grab a win in the location that way. So that can be a little bit trickier, but I did still want to draw some attention to it because I think that that could be really cool. I do think that the best way to win with location manipulation is going to be Quake, but at least want to give a shout out to Legion because it is doing something truly wacky today. For today though, that is going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.